Country bad, love them homeland. We'll never give it up to another nation. This a we we the fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. Follow me now. This a we the fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. This a me name is Pupa. Belize me come from the Belize City area. 110% Belize and proud of it. Don't tell me about maritime area. Long time ago agreement by the slave master. Talking about the head on the Belize and dollar because patriots. All people who love them country bad, love them homeland. We'll never give it up to another nation. Them country bad, love them homeland. We'll never give it up to another nation. This a we the fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. Follow me now. This a we the fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. This a me name is Pupa. Belize me come from the Belize City area. 110% Belize and proud of it. Don't tell me about maritime area. Long time ago agreement by the slave master. Talking about the head on the Belize and dollar because patriots. All people who love them country bad, love them homeland. We'll never give it up to another nation. Them country bad, love them homeland. We'll never give it up to another nation. This a we the fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. Follow me now. This a
From beautiful Belize, sweet Southside, 3304 Mandela Drive behind Zinc Fence. It's time for Sunday Review, the only news review talk show in Belize. Hope I will make sense of the news. We are on local channel XTV on Facebook and YouTube, XTV Belize. I'm the host and producer, Sister YaYa Marin Coleman. And today is Sunday, May 24, 2026. The co-host, the Breddah Mutota, revolutionary from out of the Twin Islands and Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. And our guest this morning is Toivo Asheekee, Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at Georgia State University. No stranger to Sunday Review. Morning, everybody. Morning, Brother Akko. Morning, Brother Toivo.
Good morning, Sister YaYa.
Morning.
Good morning to our guest, Brother Toivo Asheekee. Good morning to our listening audience. It's a pleasure once again to be on Sunday Review.
Brother Toivo, morning. How do you feel this morning?
Morning. No, I feel good. Resting up a bit for my last week of summer teaching, but overall feeling positive.
Give thanks. You know, I had to make sure that we get the guests we could carry this conversation. And our guests usually could carry conversations, thanks to primarily Brother Akko. And so tomorrow, Monday, May 25th, is recognized on the continent of Africa and globally as African Liberation Day. Brother Akko as the elder. For people who want to know what the African Liberation Day, tell you what the African Liberation Day, and then I want to ask Brother Toivo to give it for his interpretation as well.
So, African Liberation Day was first established by the then OAU as a day of reflection and commemoration for the struggles African people were waging in Africa against colonialism and neocolonialism. At the time African Liberation Day was established, there were colonies in Africa, Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, Angola, and Mozambique under Portuguese rule, and the apartheid system existing in South Africa and Namibia. So what happened was that this day was established as a day to reflect on the struggles and to extend solidarity to people of African descent. It moved from being called African Liberation Day to Africa Day, and I think now the AU now has a different name for it. So it's no longer called African Liberation Day. But those of us in the struggle, those of us who understand that neo-colonialism still exists, we still think that the second liberation of Africa is yet to come. And so African Liberation Day is what I still call it, and a number of my colleagues still call it.
Thanks, Brother Akko. Brother Toivo?
Yeah, no, I mean, mostly maybe some brief context to the time. Because also, as many maybe in the Western Hemisphere might know, also maybe like in the North American side, you sort of have like the African Liberation Support movement people. You have certain people who begin to start in the early 1970s having these African Liberation Solidarity Day marches across the Western Hemisphere and stuff, sort of building on some of that, if you will, continental legacy. Like I also sort of, in two ways. One, particularly in 1963, in that mid 1960s period, as Malimu has said, there are still many African countries that are not free. So to declare that as a day itself sends a signal, and a signal of intent in terms of those ones are going to be free, right? Even if some of the states were limited initially in what they could do to do some of that anti-colonial work, but eventually that does happen, right? And so I think it just sort of was important, particularly again to that time, this understanding of African freedom and everyone having to come together to fight for African freedom.
So initially, when they had the first conference of independent African states, April 15th, 1958, in Accra, Ghana. At the time, African ancestor Kwame Nkrumah was the first president of Ghana. And so the intention was to get together people from heads of states who get political independence from European colonial power, with the intent of strategizing, unifying to ensure that other countries on the continent get them political independence as well. And then the name moved, like Brother Akko said, from Africa Freedom Day, African Liberation Day. I don't know what the new name is. But the bottom line is that like there was a goal intentionally recognizing imperialism, colonialism, all isms and schisms. I would argue that Africa is still not free. And by extension, other primarily territories will have African descendants, like for let's say the Caribbean or Abayala, known as Central America. So if you could give me some wider historical context of what was happening. We know we had the enslavement, kidnapping of African people primarily by Europeans, and then what happened on the continent of Africa, what happened in other territories. To get to the 60s, I wanted to know from Brother Akko from the Caribbean and from you, Brother Toivo, on the continent of Africa, what was happening leading up to this first conference in 1963? I'm sorry, 1958.
You want to hear from me on that?
Yeah, I can maybe go. If you want me to go first, I can go first, and then you
go
can
ahead, Brother Toivo.
Yeah. Okay. So, let me give myself, as always, to try to be disciplined, a little bit of a timer, just to make sure I don't go on and on. But maybe so one of the things I looked at in my book, sort of going into this early 1958 period.
One
right?
second, brother. How you gonna just drop about my book? Tell me we're a book. We're a book me. We're a book both.
Yeah, no. This book we wrote, arming black consciousness, looking at the Azanian black nationalist tradition and South Africa's armed struggle. It came out a few years ago. Part of why I wrote that, or some of the inspirations behind some of that also, right, is also, if you can imagine, in a Western Hemisphere sense, right? And I know, Malima, you would understand this, right? There's a different, there will be two different understandings of, say, Black Power in Trinidad if you're taking an Eric Williams line, or if you're taking an Injak line, or if you're taking another a Makandal Daga line, or some other lines, right? In the same sense, on the African continent, different liberation struggles had different lines and different ways they were understanding what this freedom thing was, right? And at the time, particularly coming out of the World War II, if you know, the European colonies are very weak, right? Europe's economies are destroyed. They bombed each other into submission. And actually, again, India almost won levels of independence during World War II, if people actually look in some of these census, right? And there was a big disagreement. I'm giving a different history going into the 50s here. There was a big disagreement, particularly among some of the South African liberation struggles, or those that were emerging to be liberation struggles, around what to do during World War II, right? Many were saying this was the time to go on strike. this is the time to attack the apartheid regime because they are in alliance with the British. And there's dissension among the Boers themselves between those who are against the British and are more aligned with the Germans and are using this as their own opportunity. And then you have the more Anglophone, if you will, who have generally been in charge in the early first quarter of the 20th century. Right. And so some Africans are saying, no, now we must go on strike. Now is when we must, encourage the people to rise up when they're weak. There are others who are countering, and this is where some of the ANC does have levels of accountability. There are some who are saying, no, there's a liberal order that's possible here where we can push for certain kinds of radical things. And the Communist Party that has to be underground at this time, or is more underground at this time, as we know, is given directive from the Soviet Union to be more open to the British and the French, particularly in the colonies, right? And so there's an interesting dynamic going into these sort of spaces coming out of World War II in terms of who are we going to support and why. We understand who ends up winning, right? And there was an expectation, particularly because initially it is that more liberal, if you will, vision that supports the Allies in some senses. Many people, such as my grandfather, such as my namesake, Andimba Toivo, such as many South Africans and people from India, Pakistan, many places from the Caribbean, they are conscripted to serve in World War II. Just like World War I, right? And this is very important because that generation is the ones who come back and are very central to some of the struggles that are going into the 50s. They have seen war, they have seen a particular kind of a perspective, and they were given promises of a better order, particularly the South Africans, who end up winning out the more liberal ANC, if you will, order in terms of supporting the war to end fascism, if you will, with the Germans and Italians, right? But now in the post-World War II period, right? Okay, what's now the position? Are we getting these things? No. In South Africa, then you have apartheid comes to power. After we have sat here and we supported people during World War II. It's this sort of which begins these splits within some of the liberation movements that now when you're going into the 1950s, you're having the emergence of different tendencies across the African continent. Nkrumah has been invited back to Ghana by some of the movements inside, particularly after the successful Pan-African conference in Manchester. He's been invited back in ways to help some of the insurgent struggles there as they're building and seeing a weakness in the British for independence. Remember, India also becomes independent in the late 1940s. This is really critical. India becomes independent and the communists come to power in China. This is very important for Africa. Right? Because it's also showing if this is going into Bandung. People hear about Bandung in these conferences, right? It's going into these kinds of moments, right? And so as your 50s are moving in this kind of way, right? Your teachers, you have this post-World War II generation, right? Which is emerging. And because much industry has been destroyed in Europe, there is some industry that is being built in the colonies and that is emerging to sort of create a sort of kind of a working class, sort of a educated, if you will, illiterate in the European language elite, etc., that's beginning to emerge in some of these places. Your Julius Nyerere, right? Your Kenneth Kaunda, right? Nelson Mandela. Colleges are emerging in some of these areas, and you're beginning to have an emergence of a class that's articulating itself in certain terms of independence that is coming from the UN human rights and these freedom charters, particularly coming after World War II, and the horrors of the Holocaust are emerging, etc., etc. And so to close out, Aimé Césaire, right? Part of also what he argues, right? That great Martinican Pan-Africanist, right? Marxist, he says that, listen, much of the horrors that you are seeing in the Holocaust is simply industrialization of capitalism in Europe's backyard. But that has been happening throughout the colonies. The African peoples have been dealing with this, and it is that voice that has to emerge in terms of the force for independence. So I want to put it in that wider context is because 58, going into that moment, Ghana, a lot is riding on Ghana. Even Dr. King flies to Ghana to come to the Independence Day celebrations in the 1950s. Right? The Vice President, Richard Nixon, has to fly out because they're trying to get their seat at the table. Remember, Ghana is typically a British colony, not necessarily American at the time. There is an Afro-American population and some Caribbean populations who are also interested in Ghana in particular ways, particularly the name even Nkrumah chooses, as they have their 5 years leading into 58. They had to have an apprenticeship period between 1951 to like 1957, something like this, to transition Ghana for independence. Okay, so that's sort of your context going into 58 about what's possible. There's still only a few African countries that are independent. Remember, we're just now in the context of Sekou Touré, who would make his challenge of the French, right? As the French West African colonies are moving, this is all kind of happening at the same time. The North African countries are moving, right? But it's still early, but there's a lot of hope. Thinking about what's going into 58, as it were, as if you will, a little bit of a dress rehearsal for 63. So I'll pause there.
Excellent. Very comprehensive and easy to follow. From the continent perspective, prior to 1958, when they had the first Conference of Independent African States in Accra, Ghana. Brother Akko, give us the framing for the Caribbean for that same time period as Brother Toivo
Well,
shared with
let
us.
me, not before I go to the Caribbean, let me just say this, a point he made about the impact of the war, Second World War, and on the colonies and oppressed peoples around the world. But I want to go back to the First World War, right? Because the point he made about the different streams or tendencies, that was the same conflict in World War One, right? In reading V.I. Lenin in his book The State and the Revolution, there's a point of view that working class people should not support the war because it was a weak point for imperialism, and that the left should attack while they were weak. This World War One, and Lenin argues that comes up in Lenin's The State and the Revolution. And he interprets this thing, what he called the bourgeois. Said the bourgeois abandoned the working class and chose the nation state. And so they then, when the left went to fight in an imperialist war, right, supposedly for the freedoms or whatever that it promised in World War One. Now, a lot of the soldiers who returned will tell you that they were discriminated in Europe. One of our founding anti-colonial figure, YaYa Butler, he fought in Egypt, and he said there was a revolt among West Indian soldiers against the racism that they experienced from the European soldiers. So you had this sort of conflict with the left, if you want to call it the Marxists, some arguing that we should support the war effort, okay? And some say, no, this is not a working class, this is imperialists fighting each other. And while we have them fight, let's defeat them. The same argument emerges in the Second World War, right? And so for me, there are lessons from this as to how we approach these conflicts, these so-called global conflicts or these conflicts of freedom. Because when you look at what is happening now, right, all the wars that the US and Europe is fighting right now, they're saying it's the same thing. It's for freedom, when in fact it just preserves the status quo. So to me, that is the thing we have to understand as progressive people, that we have to be skeptical. We have to take an ideological position that this is not our war in some cases, and we have to challenge the narrative propagated by the imperialists as to what is the benefit of the war for working people. Because at the end of it all, the two wars that were fought, working people did not benefit from it. And this
excellent point, Brother Akko. Just for context, World War I was from July 28, 1914 to November 11, 1918, and World War II was from September 1st, 1939 to September 2nd, 1945. That was an excellent point you picked up on Brother Akko. We have another 12 minutes in this segment, so if you could share with us the Caribbean perspective, please.
So the Caribbean perspectives, a lot of people from the Caribbean volunteered to fight in the first war. In fact, a number of Caribbean people who were in the Tuskegee Airmen, for example, that famous aircraft group with the U.S. Army. As I mentioned before, a number of them fought in the wars, in the First World War. However, the second so-called Second World War, for example, let me go back to the First World War. The First World War, the experiences of the First World War radicalized Caribbean people. Because when the men came back, they had a whole different perspective on political, social relationships. Because they were seeing white men who in the Caribbean, were told was superior to them. They were seeing them scared, crying, right? And the black soldiers from Africa and from the Caribbean proved to be fearless and ferocious in their fight against the Nazis. So this then broke the back of colonialism psychologically, because here it is, they were fighting side by side with some of these scared white men, right? Second World War did the same thing. It even accelerated the what I call the consciousness of these people. When they came back, they began to share their stories about what they experienced. And you would find that, for example, in Trinidad, a lot of the people who fought in the wars were some of the people who were influential in starting things like friendly societies, the cooperative movement, right, in the Caribbean in some cases. I know, for example, in Trinidad. So these experiences accelerated a consciousness that eventually gave birth to what we call the independence movement in the Caribbean.
I appreciate your framing. I'll ask both of you, we have another, let me see, make I put on my glasses, another 10 minutes. Oftentimes when we have these conversations, over and over again, you hear about the brothers in leadership. You do not hear about the sisters in leadership. And the energy of the isms and schisms, meaning imperialism, capitalism, colonialism, oftentimes is rooted in patriarchy, the domination of men over women. And so Mecca here on a perspective on the role of women at that time period, both from the African perspective and from the Caribbean perspective. You could go first, Brother Toivo, then Brother Ako, and I got about 5 minutes each.
Okay, cool. So yeah, no, absolutely, right? And so a lot of this is like dual again. So on the one hand, many of the records and many of the certain things that we look at themselves have their own biases in much of what they record, right? So for example, in some of the Namibian movements in the 1950s, right? Given some of the Christian conservatism of a lot of some of the Dutch, the Boers and some of the other folks, they did not like talking about how central women were to a lot of the early uprisings in Windhoek and in some of the urban struggles that were hitting that particular area. So there's multiple silences we do have to fight through and that we are trying to fight through to uncover these things. But just to give some broad like things, right? What people, for example, some people would be familiar of Funmilayo Ransom Kuti, right? Many of her and some of the Igbo women and some of the other Nigerian women, right, in that 1920s and 30s period are very central, right, in terms of organizing some of the first anti-colonial revolts that are able actually to cut across ethnic group, tribe, and space because they have context in the market systems, because they have context as domestic workers, because of, in ways, the gendered forms of their labor in the colonial system, right? Interestingly enough, they do actually have interesting access to a number of things. And there are a number of women who are maybe not directly in that, but are able to sort of mobilize the resources of the sisters in this particular way, are actually at some of the forefronts of some of those movements in the 1920s and 30s. So much so that even certain white women began to start to now take quote unquote Igbo women seriously in terms of anthropological things to understand, right? Because they were so impressed by how the African women were doing things that even they could never imagine themselves doing. So that's one thing to sort of think about if you think there, right? I gave the example of Windhoek, right? Even if we look in the 1950s, one of the main things on the African continent, right, was what people would know as the Mau Mau. Remember, Malcolm X talks about this, but we think of the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, right, which was in Kenya, as we understand, right? What people don't know is you have Field Marshal Muthoni Wakirima, right? Who actually was one of the women commanders of the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, because in those indigenous traditions that they went back in onto to fight the British in terms of some of the ceremonies. Those of you familiar again with some of your voodoo, some of your condomble, some of your Santeria things, some of your African Kikongo ceremonies, the Kikuyu, while different, there's echoes of some of that similarity in some of the blood rites, the oaths to the ancestors to not spill secrets, to swear fealty to the struggle. It was not a gender thing like only men are the ones who were fighting. It was seen as everyone is to fight. And Kirima is one of the women who becomes field marshal, head of the entire Kenyan Mau Mau, and even struggled after they were forced to surrender in Kenya in the early 1960s, right? And was now denied access as a job and now had to be socialized into a sexist colonial system in a supposedly free Kenya. But the women were central in the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army. That was part of its success, from the intelligence networks to the poisonings, as well as the outright distractions of some of the planes, right? They would make fires at the night in certain points to pull the planes off things so they could attack somewhere else. Women are all central in these struggles. And actually, unfortunately, we have the torture records from the British that were sealed for many years. And in the torture records of the guerrillas, many of those who they are torturing are women who are central in this struggle. And those records were sealed for many years. Although some of the stories, of course, for people who remain, we do now have, some of you would have heard some of these things that are becoming unsealed in Kenya over the last 10 years or so around what was happening with the British and these crazy people then. So I want to say again that as I round up the comments, my 5 minutes is that you have many women who are across the continent who are fighting and struggling in many ways and in many different kinds of spaces, particularly even in North Africa, right? There's an idea under the Muslim societies there in Tunisia, Libya, and Algeria that women are just quote unquote passive. But even if you read Fanon, right? Fanon talks about in A Dying Colonialism in the Algerian situation, how even through the anti-colonial struggle, gendered relations have to change. Father changes to daughter, daughter changes to mother, mother changes to husband, aunt changes to niece. So there is a transformation that happens even in struggle among gendered relations that even changes. So I want to kind of lay that out, that is always there and central and strong and important. Even in those 58 conferences, women are central in those struggles in ways that the records often don't times talk about.
Big thanks, brother. And that's something critical, because oftentimes people will get, no, everybody got colonial papers from kindergarten to PhD, the colonial papers, the European worldview. But especially those what they call with higher education, so they call it, they oftentimes don't have or hear these types of narratives. They may get some of it if they have a radical professor in a traditional white institution, if they maybe they go to a historically black college or university. For here, this narrative oftentimes is not told, or they not tell it like how Brother Toivo just tell it. So big respect for the clarity and for the first time some people hear the knowledge. Brother Akko, your turn.
So, Sister YaYa, one has to understand that during that period, the universal paradigm socially was patriarchy, whether it was the left or the right, that men were at the front and women were the so-called at the back. I mean, it came out of this whole religious thing, you know, and so on and so forth. So that was the paradigm, right? It is only as women began to speak that the left began to look at the issue of feminism and the equality of women. So even though women were fighters and had capacity to do things, because of the dominant paradigm of patriarchy, you know, women were marginalized in a lot of instances. So, for example, I'll give you a couple modern things. I remember speaking with Elaine Brown, Black Panther, and she said the same thing. Even though that movement, the Black Panther, existed in the city, she said when she became leader, it was a problem, even though she was the one most capable. because of the dominant paradigm of patriarchy. I remember clearly the first book I read on about feminism was Michelle Wallace, Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman. And the reason I read the book is because people were saying that she was dogging black men in America. So I wanted to get a first-hand look at what she was saying. And when I read the book, I realized a lot of what she was saying was correct. That two people are in the struggle, both are sacrificing, but yet when the woman comes home, she had to go cook. The man, as a male, he's the one to not to do certain things and so on. So these things existed because of the dominant paradigm of patriarchy. And the last good example I want to give you, which I lived through, was the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas issue. When Anita Hill said that this man was not fit to be on the Supreme Court, most of the Belgians, I had a store, and that was a raging debate in my bookstore. And the thing that most of the brothers fell on, the side they fell on was, well, it's a brother, give him a chance, and the sisters sometimes hold brothers in certain kind of harsh ways. Not understanding that this was our own patriarchal tendencies that made us not examine Clarence Thomas politically and ideologically. You see, and this is still an issue even in organizations now. So while we have made some progress, the dominant philosophy and paradigm of patriarchy is something that we still have to examine in a very significant way in order to advance our struggle. In some traditional systems in Africa, it still exists. In some religious organizations in the Caribbean, it still exists. So this is an ideological deficiency, and it is an ideological deficiency that we must examine and correct if we can speak of liberation in a qualitative sense.
Again, big point, Brother Akko. When we come back from the break, and carry me in this direction now, it's critical to understand that most of the conversation that within one European worldview, which are the last one, as in African and indigenous people, had a different worldview. And because we are disconnected, no other worldview, we get caught up in thinking that this is the only worldview and it is the right worldview. And many of we recognize that. And like we more colonize mentally than the colonizer themselves. So it's really feeding back into that, the different streams that Brother Toivo introduced, is to understand that leaders had different mindsets, and some of them betrayed us, like they still betray us now. And so I want to go back, Sankofa, and leave it, when we come back in the second segment, to talk about the worldview of African and indigenous people when it comes to prior to European colonization, so that for generations, even if it was handed down orally, by the time they had contact with European, the people had more knowledge of civilization before they, of spirituality, of understanding the connection to nature, and how much that has fortified them with all the modernity of European people, and that we, the living, whether we recognize it or not, are born with those memories in our being, whether we recognize it or not. So even when we think these challenges are so huge and how we want to overcome their systems of their own for generations, it's to know that we have that in we, but for it to be awakened and for us to collectively come together and remember our skin folk and our skin folk and our kinfolk, so that not everybody we could work with, and not everybody going further to reach the goal of total liberation. But we have to have them conversations because of the unborn and then the young people who are still here. So we're going to take one quick break. Thanks very much, Brother Toivo, Asheekee, and Brother Akko Mutota. We'll have one conversation about African Liberation Day. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
I have the house of the neighborhood. Everyone comes and say, "Oh my goodness, Miss Allen, your house looks so good. It's so high." Man, I'm so overwhelmed. My goodness, I actually own my own house, and I didn't even expect to be the recipient of no government, nothing, never. I've never thought about that for myself. I always thought about working, making it for myself, and one day I just said, you know what, I'm going to see what my government can do for me. It doesn't matter who was in. When this lady called me and said, Miss Allen, my name is Marisa, and I'd like to meet with you. After sending in an application to MIDH, email, not through anybody else, but through email. The first thing that she told me, that this is not politically based. So we're going to go off. You're a single mother and you made this application as a Belizean citizen. I knew right then that I was in good hands. We signed that paper and that was the happiest day of my life. And it's been 4.5 years. I always ask God for guidance and the words to speak to her whenever I had any concern, and how to best go around it so that she doesn't get frustrated and I don't get frustrated. We couldn't get here today if I did not take a seat and just be patient and trust God and trust her to deliver this house to me.
Many times people get very frustrated, they call, they say mean things, but we have to understand them, and my team now has gotten to the point where we understand the frustrations of our people.
I am very proud of this project with building the homes and providing Belizeans with hope. This is the first time I've seen a project affect Belize nationally.
Every day, we access energy for cooling, lighting, and powering our electrical appliances and devices at work and at home. During cooler months, we rely less on cooling appliances such as fans and air conditioners. However, during warmer months, as the temperature and humidity rises, we use more energy to cool our spaces, and our appliances and electrical devices work harder than they do during the rest of the year. When the months become hotter, let's all practice energy conservation. Here are a few changes that you can make to manage your energy use. Check that all appliances and electrical devices are working efficiently. Turn lights off when not in the room. Unplug chargers, appliances when not in use. Turn off fans and TVs. Use energy-saving light bulbs such as LEDs. And look for the Energy Star products when purchasing appliances and electrical devices. These easy changes can reduce energy use and costs. You can also monitor your energy use during the month by reading your meter and calculating the reading using BEL's bill calculator on our mobile app or by visiting our website. Let's all save energy.
Life moves fast. Your connection should keep up. Need more credit? More data? A flex bundle that fits your lifestyle? With Smart Prepaid, they're a prepaid option for every lifestyle and budget, making it easy to stay connected wherever you are. Because with Smart Prepaid, you can connect on your terms. Purchase credit, data, flex bundles, prepaid plans, and all your favorite prepaid services at any Smart agent, Smart showroom, or simply dial *100# key. No stress, no waiting. Just fast, easy, convenient ways to stay connected every day. Smart Prepaid. Connect on your terms.
At Atlantic Bank, your convenience is our priority. Our contact center is designed to enhance your banking experience. With a wide range of customer service options, you save time and effort. You can easily call in to block or unblock your debit and credit cards, perform account inquiries, and access detailed card information. Whether you need assistance with online banking, merchant support, or general inquiries, our team is ready to help. For added convenience, if all operators are busy, you can leave your number and an operator will return your call as soon as possible to ensure you receive the support you need. Depending on your transaction type, we may need to verify your identity through a set of security questions. And remember, Atlantic Bank will never request your username or password for Atlantic Online via phone call, text, or email, ensuring your personal information remains safe and secure. Our support team is available Monday to Friday from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. in both English and Spanish. Simply dial 223-1212. This is a dedicated line for our contact center. Atlantic Bank is committed to providing you with exceptional service and the tools you need to manage your finances conveniently and securely. Take full advantage of our easy-to-use contact center services today.
Atlantic Bank, building the future together.
This Mother's May, celebrate the woman who makes the house feel like home all month long. Great deals like 15% off bathroom and kitchen fixtures from Moen, Hansgrohe, and Duraflow. Plus 15% off Hispasensa tiles, Stormguard windows, and 40% off Sunlight windows. And 15% off Berger paints and huge savings on clearance colors. So come in to Habet and Abet or Brothers Habet, call us or WhatsApp us today and make this Mother's May one to remember. Happy Mother's Day to all marvelous moms.
Nobody give it to no Guatemala. This time me name is Pupa. Belize me come from the Belize City area. 110% Belize and proud of it, sir. Don't tell me about maritime area. Long time ago and proud of it, sir. Don't tell me about maritime area. Long time ago agreement by the slave master. Talking about the head on the Belize and dollar because patriots. All people who love them country bad, bad love them homeland. Will never give it up to another nation. Country bad, bad love them homeland. Will never give it up to another nation. This is the we we the fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. Follow me now. This is the we the fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. This is me. My name is Pupa. Believe me come from the Belize.
Back to the second segment of Sunday Review with Brother Toivo, Asheekee. They have to tell me how to pronounce the African name. You know, we're well mentally enslaved, and we used to say European words, so I don't got no problem with my brother to correct me. Toivo Asheekee, scholar activist, comrade. Here I studied the call Brother Ako Mwalimu, that means teacher. So Mwalimu, Brother Ako Mutota. Welcome back to this second segment. We have really rich conversations during the break, but they're not everything for here. I'm telling you right now. But one of the things in reflection, I think Brother Toivo said it when I asked about women, and he mentioned African ancestress. What's her name? The sister. Funmilayo Ransome.
Yeah, Funmilayo
Kuti. Funmilayo Kuti. That's
Right.
Funmilayo Kuti's mother.
One of the things that when you said that to make I think about, it make I think about how Brother Ako often talk about class. And then I mean market women, then the working class women who represented themselves, organized themselves, and held the British government accountable and humbled them. And so oftentimes, whenever we hear stories or historical truths and narratives, many times written by the European themselves, who are the majority oppressor, and we hear about our African people fighting for their liberation, we don't hear what everyday people do. And it's important for us to note that everyday people have one historical pattern of being knowledgeable. So that can be part B. I just think about that just now. But before I went to break, I talked about African and indigenous people having a different worldview when it came to organizing their families, their communities, spirituality, the environment. And so that when they came in contact with European people, they already had that in them. So if Brother Toivo and then Brother Ako could share with me from an African and Caribbean perspective, how African and indigenous people who had that knowledge, how that is what really sustained them for us to still be here today.
Yeah. Okay, maybe let me take one jab at it and give something, maybe give some concrete examples of some interesting ways to also bring the African and indigenous, if you will, also to even bring some of our indigenous First Nations peoples into the conversation as well, because there are some interesting things, particularly through the process of enslavement at its height. We begin to start seeing a recognition of certain groups of people of each other from African and indigenous. So, for example, right, one thing is what we talk about, and you'll hear about this a lot. Well, let me begin with this. On the continent, there's at least five, six, seven different ways people organize their families, right? So again, we can give broad tendencies. Different regions and different areas will have different specificities depending upon whatever it is. And of course, colonialism has changed a lot of these things, but some of these things still endure, right? So some of the things, let me think of one thing will be the idea of matrilineality, right? The matrilineal society, right? Let's give a concrete example of what that means. So technically speaking, technically on my side of my family, there are two different ways we can lean on. I'll lean on one wave in my family. What we can say is my heir, me, is not my son or my daughter. My heir would be my sister's firstborn son. You see, because my inheritance goes through the mother's line,
And
right?
which group of people are you referring to?
So, for example, this would be some Bantu people, some of the Congo people, some of them, not all. Again, because when I say Congo, it's a large area, and sometimes to be specific, but that's a particular tendency, right? So, say for example, the Kingdom of the Congo, right? The Kingdom of the Congo, which is where the Portuguese first have an interaction with the Congo, are some of the first who were exported into the African continent, right? One tendency of them was this one, and so sometimes what you have is power. For example, if you look at this movie called Quilombo, or looking at Palmeiras, this Portuguese movie, right? One thing which you'll see in many African lines is there will always be a woman figure who actually is not necessarily in the public sphere, quote unquote public, in the European sense of the world. But because we are very spiritual people and we're people who are mobilizing differently, she's always the power behind each throne, right? And there's actually were interest in the Portuguese were very frustrated because they came with a certain picture, the idea we look at the men are the ones who we want leadership. I want to talk to the king. I don't want to talk, who is she? You see, but we didn't have that perspective. And so it's even themselves they're frustrated because they have to work through these women in order to actually get certain things, right? So that's an example of a way. Not saying, if you will, men are not coming into political power. It would still be my sister's son, right? But that changes in many ways the idea of my relationship to mine, because then my son would inherit from his mother's line. You see? And so that's when we understand marriages and what even a marriage is in that context, it's a different power relation than how the Christian understands it. Right? In terms of even just what the marriage is signifying in this kind of sense. My son actually is more of the wife's family's property, if you will. It's that, and that's something very interesting and similar when the Europeans come to the east coast of the United States, what is now Virginia and that area, South Carolina. The Spanish are also incredibly frustrated with this because marriage things don't exist the way they understand it, and things are going through the mother. So, for example, some of the early conflicts between the colonists of the British and the Spanish against the indigenous people is around domestic abuse. Because domestic abuse and assault was something that had never happened in their history before. They had no conceptualization of a man hitting a woman. It wasn't a thing that they'd ever seen before. And so many of the early revolts are because you have these European men who are marrying or getting into these relationships with First Nations women and not understanding that in this situation, you are joining her household. It's not the other way around. So your last name is not her. You see, it's not. No, you take her last name. You see. So you see that you can immediately see the violence brewing now between a particular culture that's coming that's not. And so some of the Africans in particular ways, who are not all, there are other Africans who are coming from more of a patriarchal line, but even then, legitimacy must still come from a matriarch in some sense, particularly in these royal lines. You will always have to have that. It will not just be one. right? It generally is never that in that sense, right? Only through the Christian or some of the more conservative Christian and Muslim traditions do you see some of that begin to happen, right? And even in the Caribbean, if you go, I mean, Queen Nanny of the Maroons, people talk about her, right, and her brothers and some of the disagreements there, right? You talk about Barbados and the huckster women. We talk about the market women, right? The huckster tradition is very, very well known in places like Barbados, South Carolina, across the Caribbean, right? It's a power network. It's a network actually itself where you are also exchanging goods through spaces, right? And there's power within that dominating these market spaces, particularly as a capitalist economy is growing, becoming more urbanized. So even the Europeans are not growing their own food. They need the market women, or else you can't actually feed even their own proletarianization. But anyway, that's more of some examples of some of the ways people were trying to live in different kinds of ways. Yes, in some ways there's the father's line. There is some of that. So on one line, I do have that. But even when it comes to what you're inheriting, if you don't have a particular conception of private property, inheritance is less like this property in capitalist commodified terms. You inherit the responsibility for the property. And if you are unable to execute your responsibility, then you will lose rights to it. So even that is not necessarily a European capitalist term. And even if you're saying it is say more of a patrilineal type of a thing, there's a responsibility to feeding a large yourself that if you cannot make, someone else will be having to take that. So that's maybe an example of some of the ways, particularly even the indigenous peoples. The the records are clear. Most of the caciques and the chiefs and the micos, half of them in many of these places are women. The Spanish of Hernando de Soto, when he's going through what is now South Carolina, he's just noting women all along the way. There are men when he goes to Alabama in the positions of leadership, but most of who he sees is women who are in charge.
Respect. That was an excellent example to use of the matrilineal line. And you're doing a good job explaining it from your own lived experience. Brother Akko?
So my perspective would come from the point of view of mythology, because mythology is the sort of bridge that connects known reality to existing reality. And so if you look at African mythology, you will always see women central to a lot of the mythology. So I will begin with the so-called myth of the origin myth of Isis and Osiris, or what people call Osa and Oset. Right? So the line is that Isis, who's a female, is the sister of Osiris because she's a spirit of equal rank. She's a wife because she alone can satisfy his highest cravings. And she is mother because it's a duty of all women to be mother. So there you have a concept of a trinity that existed before the Christian Trinity. Wife, mother, sister, because she's a spirit of equal rank. And you can find that permeating all African cultures. In fact, there's a friend of mine who's a theological scholar, and he wrote, I don't remember the title of the book now, and one of the things he wrote in some research, he said, and the quote is that he describes a conversation with the people they call the Twi, who we call the pygmy. And they were saying that while you were killing your women as witches, we were honoring our mothers as goddesses. And they are considered, so-called primitive people. And their concept was that you were killing your mothers as witches, because he went to this place in Europe and he saw what was called the Iron Maiden, a thing that they put women into, they're accused of being witches and kill them. And he said, while you were doing that, we were honoring our women as goddesses. So there is always this concept of the role, the central role of women and the feminine spirit. And if you look at the traditional African ways of the Orisha, you will see the same thing. And one more point I would like to make is a statement Dr. Baino Bello made in a conversation we had. She's a Haitian historian. And she said the cacique was not a person. She said it was an institution comprised of men and women. And they would then sort of select someone who they felt was most appropriate to then represent to the Europeans. So when the Europeans saw that person, because they have a particular linear way of thinking, they would say, that's the king, you see, or that's the queen. And this happened similar to the Chinese. They said when the first Europeans came to, I think it was Hong Kong Bay or whatever, the Chinese selected some people and said, listen, you go and meet with the barbarians. You see, go and meet with the barbarians. And so you always had this concept of people of color having different concepts and different methodologies and philosophies of organizing their societies, right? That is not to say that there were not societies that were patriarchal. But if you see running through a theme in all African traditions and systems with this idea of the woman as central to any movement of people or power and cosmology, right? Colonialism eroded that, and we embraced aspects of Eurocentricity, and also under the pressure of the force of violence, some of these civilizations collapsed. And one of the last points I would make on this too is a very interesting book called Radiance from the Waters by Sylvia Arden Boone, who was an American sociologist who the Mende woman invited to explain. The book is called Radiance from the Waters, Mende Ideas of Feminine Beauty. And it showed you how these women had their own power circles and how they took care of certain issues in that particular. The Mende is a group of people in Sierra Leone. So yes, we always had these things. And unfortunately, they have been buried in the process of colonization and enslavement and so on. So that would be my perspective on that.
Since brother, thank you very much, brother Akko. I tell you, I know that the host, right? But sometimes I feel like I want to watch TV and really appreciate the conversation. I learn, relearn, get clarity, and I really appreciate the time we're two on to spend, and most of it gets spent teaching on yourself independently, even though you may go through formal education or not, and think for yourself, and then that with duty for come back and share with others who will never get opportunities like this, for learn differently from a European enslaved miseducation system. So I know that I got like 4 minutes, but I want to stretch leave it because I want to give each one on 5 minutes because I'm brother Akogande. And I think it come up more than once as we're having this African Liberation Day conversation, is that before African and indigenous meaning First Nation people, came in contact with primarily European colonizers, they had a different worldview when it comes to themselves, the creator, the earth. I want to share with me 5 minutes each. African and first world people, prior to contact with European, understanding of gender relationships. I know we talk about patriarchal and matriarchal, but gender relationship as in same gender. So when you hear about the LBTQ, I think maybe SS meaning double spirit, my understanding is that in some first world nations, you may have someone based on European worldview who may have certain male or female autonomy. And then they say, okay, you have them by the pastor, you're a woman. You have them by the pastor, you're a man. You're a man. But their mannerism or how they engage different from what them by the part say. My understanding that in some first world nation, they accept them people for who they are, but then there'll be some of the people wouldn't go to when they have conflict or guidance, because they recognize that them people that one level of spiritual beings what could overstand walking in both worlds. And it was never, as it is in the European worldview, a same gender, a sexual relationship primarily, and more than anything, and as somebody pointed this out to me who I never see, in the Western worldview of same-gendered people, there's still the domination, as it is in heterosexual relationship, of a male energy over a female energy. So even if you have two gender in a European worldview, there's still a power imbalance, which before my understanding of contact with Europeans, it was a spiritual experience. So If you don't feel comfortable, if you don't want to comment about that, Brother Toivo, I want to get it right. The I silent. Toivo, and then Brother Akko.
How long would you like this to maybe jump
5
in?
minutes each.
Okay, 5 minutes. Yeah. So maybe let me say a few ways, right? One, I think it's important, and this is where maybe accidentally on some level, some of the European Marxist feminists have done some interesting work, limited in ways just because their understanding of race and colonialism, I still think is problematic. But one of the things that they do also make clear is we do have to understand what does gender mean based on the material conditions of how people are living. Part of, I think, some of what is happening is that what colonialism did is transform material conditions, even as Europe itself is transforming itself, right? And so you're having different material conditions, and gender is coming within that in particular ways, and particularly with the domination of some of the Abrahamic faiths that are in many ways being colonized in some ways, and being pushed on us in particular ways. There's these interesting things that have come. What I would say, for example, is that different people are different. And a lot of what we understand of some of these cats, we have to unfortunately read into what some of the, particularly the Spanish records that are very early in the quote unquote in Americas, and then some of the Arab records that are written. And we do have some indigenous oral traditions and histories that we can think about, right? So if we give two, for example, one, you have the Tequesta, which are this First Nations group in the Florida area. I think it's the Tequesta and some of the Timucua as well, right? The Spanish, even though we distrust them, what I do trust is that they have a particular Catholic worldview that's European that will not agree with certain things. And so there are things that they are writing about that they do not agree with, which tells me this is probably accurate in terms of that some of the Tequesta did have third and fourth genders, right, in their social organization, some of these groups, right? Why is that happening? The third and the fourth genders, it's also said, is that some of these genders, if you will, also there's a particular social function because people are living a particular way. They're not living in cities and towns. They're living a little bit on the move. They're living with the fish. They're living in the marshes. They're living a little bit on the move. So society is different. Right? It's not just living in a city, you know, in a certain, it's even different from some other First Nations peoples because there are others who have a similar flexibility of gender, but they do have a certain kind of a rigidity in terms of man and woman. There's a sense of that. There are also not all First Nations are the same. So the Tequesta, like in Florida, you have this situation, you have this, right? You also have in the Carolinas, for example, there's another Spanish record talking about, one of the things they're angry about the priest and the people are angrier about with the people in this area is that they're saying that girls, when they have their first period, if you will, they can choose to have sexual intercourse with someone of their age, right? And they have herbs and knowledge of herbs that they can take to prevent pregnancy until they get to a point when they are maybe in their 20s or 30s, then they choose their husband. And then when they choose their husband, they generally will have 2 kids. So this is what he's saying, for example, right? And then he's also, that even tells you that there's a different conception even of marriage, even of what a union will look like, that the Spanish are angry. They do not agree with why should the woman be the one to choose. You see, because they're coming from a different perspective. Why is she choosing her husband? It should be the other way around. You see, that's not how their society worked in the Carolina. It didn't work that way, right? And so that's an example. I'm giving you what is now called South Carolina, Charleston, that area there, and then parts of Florida, right? If we now go to another record, we look at the Portuguese, and maybe I'll end on this one to give a different part of Africa that's a little bit out of some of what we generally know of. When the Portuguese land in what is now Cape Town, the Cape of Good Hope, by Table Mountain, we have records even of the the Portuguese now, sorry. Even the Portuguese are saying with the people who we now understand as the San people, right? They say some of the oldest people, if you will, in the Southern African area, right? The Khoisan people, right? Who later on the Dutch would be colonizing and would become some of what they call so-called coloureds and other groups and other peoples now. No? So these people who are by Table Mountain there, the Spanish are saying they could not distinguish man or woman. From how people looked and how people dressed, there was no distinguishment for them between male or female. And in what they saw people doing, there was no difference from what they saw of the people there and how they were organizing. Now, that's not the same when they go to Mozambique. There, they do see a difference between some now who are now, if you will, men, women, they do see a difference. So you see, so even in the similar area, say, Southwest Coast Africa compared to say Mozambique, there's two different ways people are now organizing themselves. So sometimes it just depends on where you are located. Ethiopia, Abyssinia, that area has a particular thing. And so I think those are some of the things to think about in some specificities. Even Hernan Cortez, when he's now attacking the Aztecs and these cats here, he's also noting in some of the different nations that are working with him that there are distinguishments amongst gender between them that's also different to each other.
Wow, that's a lot. We have to go to a break, but I have to wait till we come back after break. Forgive me, 5 minutes.
You said 5 minutes, right? I didn't go over 5. I went with 5.
We're good. So we'll take a final break. On a stay tuned, but I can't respond to the question, and then we have final question, final thoughts, and then we'll wrap up. The hour just go by fast. We'll have fun, and you'll be learning. Big thanks, brother. Break time.
In May, make Benny's your one-stop shop for appliances. We have Sankey refrigerators, stoves, microwaves, washers and dryers, freezers, smart TVs, and so much more for up to 19% off. Get amazing deals for mom and appliances all May long, and don't forget your B-Bucks whenever you make a purchase to be a part of our Homecation raffle to win $10,000 in December. Benny's, quality and savings.
Life moves fast. Your connection should keep up. Need more credit? More data? A flex bundle that fits your lifestyle? With Smart Prepaid, they're a prepaid option for every lifestyle and budget, making it easy to stay connected wherever you are. Because with Smart Prepaid, you can connect on your terms. Purchase credit, data, flex bundles, prepaid plans, and all your favorite prepaid services at any Smart agent, Smart showroom, or simply dial *100# key. No stress, no waiting. Just fast, easy, convenient ways to stay connected every day. Smart Prepaid. Connect on your terms.
I have the house of the neighborhood. Everyone comes and say, "Oh my goodness, Miss Allen, your house looks so good. It's so high." Man, I'm so overwhelmed. My goodness, I actually own my own house, and I didn't even expect to be the recipient of no government, nothing, never. I've never thought about that for myself. I always thought about working, making it for myself, and one day I just said, you know what, I'm going to see what my government can do for me. It doesn't matter who was in. When this lady called me and said, "Miss Allen, my name is Marisa, and I'd like to meet with you." After sending in an application to MIDH, email, not through anybody else, but through email. The first thing that she told me, that this is not politically based. So we're going to go off. You're a single mother and you made this application as a Belizean citizen. I knew right then that I was in good hands. We signed that paper, and that was the happiest day of my life. And it's been 4.5 years. I always ask God for guidance and the words to speak to her whenever I had any concern, and how to best go around it so that she doesn't get frustrated and I don't get frustrated. We couldn't get here today if I did not take a seat and just be patient and trust God and trust her to deliver this house to me.
Many times people get very frustrated, they call, they say mean things. But we have to understand them, and my team now has gotten to the point where we understand the frustrations of our people.
I am very proud of this project with building the homes and providing Belizeans with hope. This is the first time I've seen a project affect Belize nationally.
Paperworks Entertainment and SJ Promotion presents the official Belizean Jamaican Link-Up, the Father's Day edition. It's an all-white day party on Sunday, June 21st at the Belize Airport Authority parking lot, 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. Featuring the international reggae dancehall singing sensation stage boss, Wayne Wonder. To mash up the stage alongside the General Super G for the first time in Belize, Steely Bashman plus Belize's top DJs. Get your general tickets for $60 and VIP for $150 at Madisco, Stone Music Outlet and VIP Wireless. And lock the date for the official Belizean Jamaican Link-Up all-white day party on Sunday, June 21st at the Belize Airport Authority parking lot, 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. Sponsored by...
En Atlantic Bank, tu comodidad es nuestra prioridad. Nuestro centro de contacto está diseñado para mejorar tu experiencia bancaria. Con una amplia gama de opciones de servicio al cliente, ahorras tiempo y esfuerzo. Puedes llamar fácilmente para bloquear o desbloquear tus tarjetas de débito y crédito, realizar consultas de cuentas y acceder a información detallada de tus tarjetas. Ya sea que necesites asistencia con la banca en línea, apoyo para comercios o consultas generales, nuestro equipo está listo para ayudarte. Para mayor comodidad, si todos los operadores están ocupados, puedes dejar tu número y un operador te devolverá la llamada lo antes posible para asegurarse de que recibas el apoyo que necesitas. Para mayor seguridad, es posible que necesitemos verificar tu identidad con un conjunto de preguntas sencillas. Recuerda, Atlantic Bank nunca solicitará tu nombre de tu usuario ni contraseña de Atlantic Online por llamada telefónica, mensaje de texto o correo electrónico, asegurando que tu información personal permanezca segura y protegida. Nuestro equipo de apoyo está disponible de lunes a viernes, de 8 a.m. a 6 p.m., en inglés y en español. Simplemente marca al 223-1212. Esta es la línea dedicada para nuestro centro de contacto. Atlantic Bank se compromete a brindarte un servicio excepcional y las herramientas que necesitas para administrar tus finanzas de manera conveniente y segura. Aprovecha al máximo nuestro servicio del centro de contacto.
Atlantic Bank, building the future together.
Some hands do more than carry. They prepare, they fix, they comfort. They keep a home moving in ways few people notice. And even when the day is done, they are still thinking of home. For the months of May and June, we celebrate the hands that hold the home together, offering you 25% off on tiles, lights, fans, ACs, gardening supplies, and more, both in-store and online. Thank you, moms and dads, from Builders Hardware.
Welcome back to the final segment of Sunday Review. We run out of time fast. We had good conversation just now during the break. We couldn't finish it. Brother Akko, your 5 minutes, and then I'll ask the final question and get final thoughts.
What was the question again?
The question had to do with different genders and how African and indigenous first world nation
Right.
understood genders at that time period, as opposed to how gender is framed this from a European worldview in contemporary times?
All right, so I will address the question, but I also want to remind us that we also talk about African Liberation Day. And there are some issues that I felt we should have focused on in terms of the role that the Cubans played in Angola, and also some of the other related things directly to that subject, which I hope we can get back to. But you posed the question about gender inequality, and you framed it, I think, to some extent, as LGBTQ, which is a modern concept, right? And which we have to address politically. But I've always said to people, as I said to you, primary and contradictions. If people don't have food and people don't have water, that's a thing that we have to address, okay? You understand? Before anything else, because without life, nothing else could exist, right? But to address this specific question you posed, one of the things I have learned from the study of anthropology and so on is that there have always been different people among the humans of species, even among things like fishes, right? They're telling there are some fish that are female with male fish with female forms and so on. So what some people call anomalies, I'm not saying that humans are anomalies, but people have been differently able, if you want to call it that. No. If you were to take there's a particular group in India, there's a group of men who live all their lives as females. And they dress, act as females. And that exists. Even recently, I was reading about something in Burkina Faso, where there's a particular group of people in Burkina Faso that highlight the way even the men sometimes, live in a certain kind of with a certain kind of feminine kind of quality. The point is that all of these things have existed in human history, right? That people have been different at different points. People have their behavior being characterized by what you may call not the traditional forms, in that men play out women role, women act as men, right? This is one of the things they talk about, the women, the Amazon warriors, I think in Benin or some places. So we have had those issues. Even the issue of female genitalia circumcision, which the Europeans made a big issue of, right? I am not saying that is a practice that I support, but that is an issue to me that Africans have to resolve in their own way and in their own time. What has happened in the West is too many times we have weaponized these ideas, we have weaponized these discussions to use it as a tool to denigrate African culture and African civilization, right? One of the things I've learned very early, I think is maybe Ngugi wa Thiong'o said it. I'm not sure if it's it, but I read it in an anthology of African writers. And he said that the person said that there are traditions and there are irrelevant traditions, right? And as a society evolved, we evolved away from the irrelevant traditions, okay? But what I think colonization did is that it did not give Africans an authentic sense of evolving away from things that may be irrelevant. And sometimes when you're under oppression, you have a tendency to hold on to things as a form of what I call reactionary resistance. You understand what I'm saying? So too many times, to me, the gender issue is sometimes blown out of proportion to the reality of what is happening. And I had an interview with this sister. She wrote the book called The Invention of Women. And it's a book, a Yoruba woman. She was a professor in the university in New York somewhere. And after that discussion, a number of feminists called me and trashed the work. And she was trying to explain that this idea of gender is not as profound and important in some traditional Yoruba societies as we make it here. So we have to understand that there's politics, there's economics, there's sociology. And human beings function within those contexts in shaping societies. And there are times when societies apply certain things, like, for example, the issue of polygamy, which nobody wants to deal with. Well, the society looked at this and said, you know what? We need this in order for society to be stabilized. Then there's this issue of polyandry, in which women can have more than one husband. And so, but this is a societal response. What the West has done is to impose its own values without giving us our own lens and our own perspective to solve these problems. And I'm not saying that patriarchy doesn't exist in Africa or so on, but we have to solve these problems through our own lens, and we have to be given the opportunity to do it without the West imposing its own senses, its own values, and its own ethos upon us. Do we, in a modern sense, have to discuss the issue of gender? Yes, right? But it must be in a revolutionary context. It must be in an anti-capitalist context. A lot of an anti-imperialist context, a lot of the so-called feminists, they are advocating that U.S. imperialism, for example, bomb women in Afghanistan to get rid of the veil. So kill them in order to take off the veil, which makes no sense from a humanistic and a civilizational point of view. So your idea of feminism is so dominant that you're going to kill people to solve a cultural problem. And so these arguments are complex, and therefore we cannot just simplify it in the way in which the West wants to simplify everything. We have to look at the nuances and the variables and come to an understanding that advances not just the women or the men, but humanity as a whole. Because at the end of it, the struggle is to advance humanity economically, politically, socially, and culturally.
Big thanks, Brother Ako, and that's why I feel that the conversation comprehensive and in alliance or in alignment with African Liberation Day, because these are realities. Even though some of the points may be secondary, people don't usually have the space to hear the conversation from one objective and comprehensive point of view. So the last question I want to ask, which one gives space for we mentioned, you would have wanted us to spend more time talking about, Brother Ako, is the relevance of African Liberation Day in a 2026 from a Pan-Africanism lens. The relevance of African Liberation Day in 2026 from a Pan-Africanism lens. And the point, I think, Brother Toivo had said material needs, and you said, listen, if people don't got food, clothing, and shelter, all this political conversation I mean nothing. As a human being, me just to try live. Food, clothing, and shelter, deal with the other stuff later. I'm only for the bread, butter, pan, good side. I don't have the high political conversation. I just to try live right now. But if I make the connection that the food, clothing, and shelter have everything to do with what happened in the past. And what happened nowhere affect unborn children. So I think that maybe the power of fear, the value of true education, of liberating ourselves, thinking about African Liberation Day, is to learn how what happened in the past, make we have the material reality we have today, and for be truly free in mind, body, and spirit. We have to have that level of conversation for truly inform our worldview and not just to go along with what Mappa, Grandpa, Granny, everybody else does. So, Brother Asheekee, the question, in 2026, what are the relevance of African Liberation Day, May 25th, from a Pan-African perspective?
All right, so maybe let's try. I've been thinking about this question. Maybe let's just do maybe a few things to maybe also weave in some of what Malimu wanted to say earlier, right? In 1958, going into 1963, one of the really inspirational things, particularly in 1958 for the Africans, particularly when they were meeting in Accra. Later, there's two conferences in 58. There's one in the beginning and the one is later in the year. The one that happened later in the year, Cuba was very important to them. The Cuban rebels and the Cuban Revolution, because the Cubans were seen to many of the Africans actually as Africans. Right? Because many of them, even though Castro and some of the leadership, which they had known, if you will, were lighter skinned, right? It was known that Cuba itself right? Very much is very much has a very strong African sense of itself, the people, right? Castro knew that, right? That's why Santiago is where they have their first attempt for a coup in '54, right? In the eastern portion, I believe, in the eastern portion of the island is where they begin. That's the African portion. That wasn't accidental. That was because that is the hotbed of revolution. And so, if we think of like the Pan-African meaning of these things, particularly when we think of Venezuela, when we think about Cuba, right? When we think of it these ways, right? Are they free? Right? Chavez did the most of many leaders in Venezuela. You can be critical of him as much as you want, but people, it's like being critical of the Bolsheviks and forgetting there was a thing called a czardom before. Like the czar is an emperor. Like there's not like democracy before then, and so people forget what was actually happening before, right? Chavez really tried to make a connection with the African continent and tried very hard. This is part of why they're attacking Venezuela right now. In part, what they are attacking are the solidarity structures that Venezuela was utilizing to support people like Cuba, to support the Namibias and the other African peoples and different peoples of the world in ways that they could. Not saying it was perfect, but they tried. You see what I'm saying? That is actually what's being attacked here, right? And that's why, for me, again, the African response is critical, right, to what happens in Cuba and Venezuela, right? Particularly on this day, the challenge that I would give some of the institutional Pan-African institutions like the AU and them, you have to condemn what's happening in Cuba and Venezuela. And you have to condemn it openly. You can't be scared of this man. You actually have to stand up and say something, right? Because many of us would not have been able to have won our independence, particularly if the Cubans had not intervened, right? And many of us, indeed, were enjoying some of the benefits of Cuban healthcare, Venezuelan oil, right? And some of the solidarity that some of them were showing over the years, right? What is our position on that, right? What is our position on that, right? And so I think that needs to be really taken seriously, right? And simultaneously, if we also, so there's that connection, right? Cuba, Venezuela, I want to draw that connection, right? Then we also, sort of in the last minute, right? We have to draw the connection with AES, right? We have to draw the connection to now what is the question that it is bringing up. Whether you, even if you do agree or you disagree, there are questions of what the Pan-African future needs to look like and can look like, right? What does that mean? Right? What does these what is what is Pan-Africanism going to mean to the people? And I think Pan-Africanism has to be able to shift itself based upon what the popular struggles are of the time of the progressive peoples, right? And right now it's the youth struggles, the women struggles, the LGBTQ struggles, and the working poor struggles. So what African Liberation Day must mean, particularly in the context of a Pan-Africanism from below, right? Is we need to be looking to the movements from below again, as always, to kind of chart the way forward, right? Instead of, as unfortunately is still happening now on the continent, it's still looking to the state, the capitalist, reorganized neo-colonial state, to sort of imagine your way out of a problem that is a thing called capitalism, until you actually have an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist vision for the future that is serious about delinking and reorganizing your societies from a sense of production. You can't just talk about economic liberation without talking about anti-imperialism and societal transformation on the continent. And too many leaders are doing that. You know what I'm saying? Many of the, even now I'm listening to the Rwandans and some of the Ugandans and South Africans talking on this day. I was listening to them this morning. It's the same conversation they've been having since I was 6. Right, is this thing of economic transformation and independence, but then no anti-imperialist and no anti-capitalist critique. Then it's not going to work. So that's sort of how I will close, sort of in that sort of a broad Pan-African sense of how maybe we should think of these things.
Excellent, brother. Brother Akko?
So, Sister YaYa, what is the relevance of African Liberation Day? That's now. So I would begin by saying that it is essentially for us to learn. We are in a state in Africa and the African world where elements of the struggle has retrogressed. So the fact that in South Africa, you could have xenophobic responses to Nigerians and chasing Nigerians out and burning down their business and other Africans, when Nigeria was a pillar of support for the ANC and the liberation movement in Southern Africa. So in that sense, we have regressed, gone backward. Whereas we felt South Africa would have been in the vanguard, it is not in the vanguard. Where we have progress is with the AES. Does it have contradictions? Yes. But when you look at the economic, political, and other kinds of initiatives that the AES project is engaging on, you are seeing progress taking place there. And you're also seeing the reaction of imperialism to the progress that is being made by the AES. So, we have to learn the lessons of the two. The retrogression that has occurred and the progress that is occurring. And in the middle of that, as a kind of constant, the recurring decimal of betrayal and neocolonialism is what happened with France and Ruto in Kenya. So I wouldn't even say it's a retrogression, it's a recurring decimals, the continued betrayal of African leaders. So you have to meet three perspectives here. The retrograde position of South Africa and what it has done, the advancement of the Sahel and the AES, and then the recurring betrayal of people like Ruto in terms of making, in this day and age, when you are seeing imperialism collapsing in Ukraine, and you are now becoming an errand boy and a messenger for French neocolonialism and imperialism. So to me, we have to learn lessons from all of these things. And we could add another lesson here for African Liberation Day. The split that just occurred in Senegal between the Prime Minister and the President, in which the President has decided, it seems, from all evidence, that he has decided to align himself with the colonizers and separate from the idea that brought them to power. So to me, there is a lot to reflect on this African Liberation Day, from those four perspectives I mentioned, and also to me what I consider the pseudo Pan-Africanism that is taking place, in which countries like Benin and Ghana are giving citizenships to people in the diaspora. Yet in the case of Ghana, the AFRICOM head center is in Ghana, and that is the tool that is being used to suppress Africa. So to me, the citizenship is tokenism masquerading as some advancement, and all of these people getting all crying and so on, and so emotional, right? The reality is that we are dealing with imperialism and neocolonialism. And whether you get a citizenship from Benin or Rwanda, it doesn't change the fact that we have to struggle against imperialism and neocolonialism. So all this is what I consider emotional crap trap. We have to rise beyond that. You see, because a lot of these leaders in the Caribbean and Africa, they understand we have an emotional attachment to the idea of a united Africa. And I've always said, what kind of Africa do we, when we speak of a united Africa, what is our model? Is it modern after the US? Well, if that is the model, then we have failed before we have started. Because the United States is a settler colony that killed the indigenous people and enslaved Africans. So for me on this African Liberation Day, there is a need for a lot of reflection on what is occurring, and there is a need to me to bring qualitative ideas and substance to the idea of Pan-Africanism, because to me it is too superficial at this point in time in terms of what people what you may call convey or what they express or demonstrate as Pan-Africanism. So to sum it up, as my old uncle said to me one day in Trinidad, he said, we have a holiday for emancipation, but we are not emancipated. Okay. We have African Liberation Day, we are not liberated. And the last point I make, I forgot it earlier, was in a speech I saw Samora Machel give. And he said, a luta continua. And the master said, a luta continua. And he said in Portuguese, from what? And nobody could answer. And then he said it again, a luta continua, from what? And nobody could answer. And he said, from poverty, from patriarchy, and he lists out a number of things that the struggle must continue against. And that, to me, is what African Liberation Day must mean. Not slogans, like in Trinidad, Eric Williams said, Massa Day done, and yet he gave education to the Massa, the Catholic Church. So the struggle continues against what? And this, to me, is what we have to define. It's against imperialism, against capitalism, and against neocolonialism. And I think that is what African Liberation Day must mean.
Thanks, Brother Akko. I didn't know until you said, I think in 2002, the Organization of African Union recognized May 25th as Africa Day and not African Liberation Day. I never knew that. Quickly, Brother Toivo. Not say the YaYa. Toivo. 1 minute for your final thoughts, Brother Akko. 1 minute for your final thoughts. Final thoughts, brother.
Yeah, final thoughts. I think also just I'm always thinking again of Pan-Africanism, in as much as I'm a historian, historical sociologist, and we're looking at the past a lot. I was sort of looking at, as we've been talking, I've been looking at Walter Rodney's Grounding with My Brothers and looking at his chapter, African History and Culture, very much again, sort of trying to say that we're looking at these things because we have hope for Africa's future and Africa's presence. So again, and I think the centrality to that is the creativity that needs to happen. I think that's what people sometimes miss about dialectical materialism and some of these ways we're supposed to look at the past, is that it's also you imagine your future in these ways as well. So I still care, I still have hope. And I think a lot of the hope I have for the future and what we are able to create, I think comes from some of what I do see on the grassroots level. So on that level, I think that we're doing these things in the past because we have hope for the future, and it must be creative. We have to invent the future and create new things. It's not necessarily, as much as we're looking at the past, it's to look at the past to give us tools to imagine the future and to build it. As my father always said, he always says that it's good to dream, it's better to plan. So
big respect. Thanks, brother. Brother Akko, 1 minute final thoughts.
I will quote Professor Hilborn Watson said to me, we sometimes believe in too much metaphysics. And we have to understand everything that we do as humans, there's a materialist perspective that we must have. That is not to say we don't pay attention to our spirituality and so on. But that's why I said earlier, if people don't have water, and they don't have food, and they don't have a house, all of these debates and of gender is moot, because the fundamental and the priority is to get food, clothing, and shelter. So my thing is we have to bring some balance, and we have to look at the material condition and derive our philosophies and our practices from those material conditions in order to advance our people. But that is not, as I said, to neglect the other side, the esoteric side, if you want to call it. But we need to focus on the material. And I think this is what the Sahel is doing. They're like, you know what? We have to build roads. We have to build dams. We have to build hospitals, right? Sit down and say, well, the ancestors will provide. That cannot work. We have to do the job that the ancestors put us here to do.
Thanks, Brother Akko. And my position is it's not either or. We need the spirit and we need the physical and we need the material. Like it's the Trinity is a living experience. It's not one or the other. I want to take 1 minute just to reflect. Christy, if you could bring this up quickly. From
I'm not saying that we need to focus on either or. That was not my argument. I'm saying that we need to focus on some of these things without losing the other.
I hear that. And what I'm saying is I know they have a primary and secondary position. I feel like a lot of time is spent on the physical and not on the spiritual in the genuine way of what the spirit means, not organized religion way or how it's taught, but in a genuine way. And that's what means trusting the processes and why people lose hope, because then I say people live and dead and then I say this liberation materialize. People lose hope. And so that comes back to a relearning mind, body, spirit of individuals because before we could think about leading anybody in any way, it has to reflect enough we everyday life that this is not just talking, that this is really about the liberation of people based on how we live our life. So from the Mandela dated March 5th, 2016 from the publisher, X had written, I just want to read one paragraph. On the night of May 29, 1972, the young people of Belize City who were from PUP and NIP families were united as they had never been before and have never been since under the banner of the UBAD party. But there were events which took place that very same night which sets the stage for unraveling of the unity of the UBAD party, basically along PUP and NIP lines. I've waited almost 44 years to say a couple things publicly for the first time. The UBAD party was marching to mark Pan-African Liberation Day, which is celebrated on May 25th of each year. In 1972, UBAD decided to march on May 29th so as to combine Pan-African Liberation Day with the honoring of the largest enslaved rebellion in the settlement of Belize's history, word of which had first reached Belize town from the Belize Old River on May 29, 1773. So just to give recognition to UBAD as a cultural organization and then a political party, at that time, in going back Sankofa to remember the African ancestors and for make it relevant in a contemporary times. This is a new conversation with our people just to receive the baton from people gone before we, and this is for we to pass it on to the people who are come after we, as is our duty to do. So big thanks, Brother Toivo, Asheekee, a PhD, Brother Mutota, revolutionary, for this contribution on Africa Day or African Liberation Day. This show will repeat at 5:30 this evening on XTV. You can listen to it at any time at XTV Belize, Facebook, or YouTube. The security guard, I believe, is Shane Flowers. At XTV, where we have our sister, Krista Flowers, Master Chief Operator. I don't know if Kirsty is still in studio. Morning, Kirsty. And then downstairs at Creme Radio, I believe we have, I just gone totally blank. What about your name, Kirsty? Hey, my mind just gone blank just now. Sorry, brother. My mind just gone blank. At my age, I guess then things do happen. The brother mind of the content, the brother who is working in Creme Radio, Larry Guerrero. Thanks, Christy. Big thanks, Christy. That's why it's good to have somebody who's paying attention to the conversation. So again, enjoy the rest on a Sunday. Remember tomorrow, Monday, May 25th, 2026 is Africa Liberation Day or Africa Day. Until then, remember, say, only organize people and save the people.
We'll save the people. Thank you.
Thanks.
Nobody do it to no Guatemala. This time me name is Pupa. Belize me come from the Belize City area. 110% Belize and proud of it. Don't tell me about maritime area. Long time ago agreement by the slave master. Talking about the head on the Belize and dollar because Patreon.